Hey guys, tonight we are going to unveil the secret behind one of the most controversial deaths in English royal history. What if I told you that the tragedy leading to the execution of a famous English queen might just have been a perfectly staged drama? Was the woman who stirred up all of Europe to claim the crown, Anne Boleyn, really a traitor and an adulteress? Or was she simply the victim of a ruthless political purge? To this very day, experts are still debating, had King Henry VIII grown tired of her, or did the cunning minister Thomas Cromwell set a trap to protect himself? The evidence against Anne is thin, full of contradictions and loopholes. Yet, in just 17 fateful days, a storm of power, jealousy, and ambition sealed her fate. The truth behind the curtain is colder and far darker than anything you've ever imagined. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Before we begin, please comment below and let me know where you are watching from and what the local time is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let us gently drift back to the year 1536, as the spring air of Tudor England held its breath, though no one quite knew why. The storm did not begin with a crash, but rather with a hush, a secret whispered behind heavy oak doors. It started quietly with a single, seemingly insignificant man. On the 30th of April, in the year 1536, a court musician named Mark Smeaton, a man of humble rank, far beneath the grandeur of the throne, was taken into custody. He was not taken to a public prison, but to the private house of the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. In that quiet, controlled environment, away from the prying eyes of the court, Smeaton confessed to something utterly shocking, something that immediately sealed the fate of a queen. He claimed he had slept with Queen Anne Boleyn, not once or twice, but 3 times. This confession, of course, casts a long, unsettling shadow. Was it a genuine, conscience-driven admission? Or was it, as many historians still suggest, tortured out of him? Was it a desperate fabrication fueled by fear? Or perhaps even engineered with a promise of reward? The unsettling truth is that Smeaton, the lowest ranked among the accused, never retracted his statement. Even when facing the executioner, when the confession cost him his life, he let the damning words stand, a silent, terrifying puzzle for the ages. That very evening, the king's own actions betrayed a sudden, profound shift. Henry VIII abruptly cancelled his planned trip with Anne to Calais. He seemed restless, watchful, like a man who has just been handed a devastating, yet necessary, piece of information. The atmosphere had shifted. Something crucial, something irrecoverable, had moved in the subtle game of Tudor politics. The next day, the 1st of May, was the traditional celebration of the May Day jousts at Greenwich. It was a day of spectacle, of thunderous excitement and pageantry. Henry VIII sat in the royal box, seemingly enjoying the knights as they charged towards each other with their wooden lances. Beside him, Anne cheered for her favourites. To every eye watching, they appeared as a typical, glorious royal couple enjoying the customary tournament. But the king already carried the weight of Smeaton's whispered confession. Mid-celebration, the illusion shattered. Henry VIII rose abruptly from his seat. Without a word of explanation to his queen or his court, he rode away. He took with him his close friend and trusted confidant, the groom of the stool, Henry Norris. On horseback, the king questioned Norris, endlessly and intensely, through the night. By the time the cold dawn broke, Norris was locked within the terrifying walls of the Tower of London. The avalanche began immediately. Soon after Norris was seized, Anne herself was arrested and taken to the Tower of London, marking the swift, staggering conclusion to her magnificent rise. Her own brother, George, Lord Rochford, was also seized and imprisoned. Then came the flood of arrests. William Brereton, Francis Weston, Richard Page, and even the respected poet Thomas Wyatt were taken. Some of these men would eventually be freed, but most would not be so fortunate. The speed and scale of the arrests were breathtaking, stunning the court into silence. In a matter of mere days, the woman who had fought for 7 years to become queen had transitioned from consort and sovereign to a condemned prisoner. The enemies of Anne moved with terrifying efficiency and unprecedented haste, determined to seal her fate before the slightest chance for appeal or intervention could arise. The stage was now set for the swift, brutal conclusion of the Boleyn tragedy. The sheer speed of the downfall was what truly silenced the court. It was a dizzying, terrifying descent, moving so quickly that the very air seemed unable to catch up with events. The Queen had been arrested on the 2nd of May. Her enemies, now emboldened and sensing the King's will, wasted no time. Just 8 days after Smeaton's initial confession, on the 10th of May, in the year 1536, a grand jury was convened. This assembly was tasked with formally indicting Anne and the men accused alongside her. The legal gears, usually slow and grinding, now spun with unprecedented velocity, greased by ambition and fear. They were seeking not justice, but a rapid, conclusive end. The fate of the accused men was sealed first. On the 12th of May, only 2 days after the indictment, Mark Smeaton, the humble musician whose confession started it all, was tried alongside Francis Weston, William Brereton, and Henry Norris. The trial was swift, the outcome inevitable. All 4 men were condemned and sentenced to die. The judgment was harsh, concluding their lives with horrifying efficiency. Then, it was the Queen's turn. On the 15th of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn was brought before a jury of her peers. This should have been a setting of impartial justice, yet it was anything but. To compound the sense of utter betrayal, the tribunal was presided over by her own maternal uncle, the Duke of Norfolk. A man who should have offered protection now officiated her destruction. Anne was surrounded by hostile faces, members of the nobility who had long resented her swift rise and radical influence. The charges read out against her were nothing short of sensational, designed to shock the public and legally justify her removal. She was accused of adultery with multiple men, specifically named as the 4 who had already been condemned. Worse still, she was accused of the most grotesque of crimes: incest with her own brother, George, Lord Rochford, who was also awaiting trial. Finally, the charges claimed she and her supposed lovers had conspired to kill the king. The narrative crafted by Cromwell and Henry's legal minds was one of a morally depraved queen bent on treachery and the murder of her husband. Facing her judges and the hostile court, Anne Boleyn maintained a remarkable composure, steadfastly declaring her complete innocence. She spoke clearly, attempting to defend herself against the torrent of accusations. Yet the verdict was already decided before she even entered the hall. She was found guilty of all charges. The king, Henry VIII, who had once risked breaking with the Roman Church and overturning centuries of tradition to make her his queen, now officially and coldly turned his back. The woman who had captivated a court and ignited a religious revolution was swiftly branded a traitor to the crown and condemned to death. The sentence was initially to be burned or beheaded at the king's pleasure, the choice itself a macabre reminder of her dependence on his will. The official indictment meticulously and sensationally painted Anne Boleyn as the most sinful queen England had ever known. The document accused her of seducing 5 men, the 4 condemned, and her brother with wanton kisses, gifts and promises, of luring them into her bed at various times and places within the royal palaces. The most damning, and arguably unbelievable, charge was the claim of incest with her brother George, Lord Rochford, suggesting a conspiracy so deep that it violated the most fundamental familial taboos. The legal machinery had performed its deadly work with incredible efficiency. From the first arrest on April the 30th to the condemnation of the Queen on May the 15th, only 16 days had passed. It was a clear, chilling message to the court and to all of England. In the Tudor world, royal favour could be lost, and a life extinguished, faster than a summer thunderstorm. The foundations of her brief reign were not just crumbling, they were being violently ripped apart, piece by damning piece. Her fate was sealed, and the legal fiction that justified it had been established. This rapid condemnation served as the first, crushing weight upon the final 17 days of her life. With the verdict of guilty pronounced, one might assume the case against Anne Boleyn was airtight, built on solid evidence and irrefutable facts. Yet, as we examine the foundation of this spectacular downfall, we find that the official narrative was anything but stable. In fact, many historians have long questioned the entire truth of these sensational charges, finding them hollow and contradictory beneath the dramatic veneer of the official indictment. Let us consider the charges of seduction and adultery. The official document detailed a meticulous timeline, citing specific dates and locations where Anne allegedly lured 5 men into her bed with promises and gifts. However, When these dates were cross-referenced with court records and known movements of the Queen, many proved to be utterly impossible. Anne simply was not present at the palaces or in the private chambers where the alleged affairs supposedly took place. The logistics of the conspiracy were flawed, suggesting the charges were constructed hastily to fit a desired narrative, rather than reflecting actual events. The key piece of evidence that the entire prosecution leaned upon the weightiest plank in the crumbling bridge of proof remained the solitary confession of Mark Smeaton. Smeaton, we must remember, was the lowest ranked of all the accused. This is an essential detail. Why would a queen, who had risked a schism with Rome and fought relentlessly for her crown, now risk everything for a mere court musician? Such a reckless act defies the political caution that characterized Anne's rise. It stretches the limits of credulity to believe she would risk her life and the legitimacy of her daughter, Elizabeth, for a clandestine relationship with a man of his standing. His statement, therefore, was most likely the product of immense pressure. In the terrifying world of the Tudor regime, a man held in Cromwell's custody knew the consequences of silence or denial. The confession was likely extracted under duress, pain, or the promise of a quicker, less agonizing death. It was a statement born not of truth, but of fear, pain, or perhaps even bribery. Anne Boleyn herself, despite the overwhelming power arrayed against her, never wavered in her defense. In one of the most solemn acts a Catholic could perform even in a newly Protestantizing England, she swore before the Eucharist, on the peril of her very soul's damnation, that she was innocent of all charges. For a queen who understood the profound spiritual weight of such an oath, this was arguably the most powerful piece of evidence offered in her defense, though it was dismissed by the hostile court. Even those who despised Anne Boleyn had to admit the evidence was remarkably thin. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, a staunch enemy of Anne because she represented the break with Rome and the downfall of Queen Catherine of Aragon, wrote back to his master, admitting that most of the accused men were condemned without valid proof or genuine confession. This admission from an enemy is damning testimony against the fairness of the trial. We must understand that in Tudor England, especially one ruled by the volatile Henry VIII, a queen's trial was never a true quest for justice. It was a political execution disguised by legal theatre. Anne was surrounded by hostile peers, led by the aforementioned Duke of Norfolk, and looming above them all was the unyielding absolute will of the king himself. The fundamental question remains: was Henry VIII genuinely convinced by the fabricated charges of adultery and incest? Or did he simply need a rapid, legal justification to rid himself of a queen who was now seen as politically and personally redundant? The answer, as we shall see, lies not just in the flimsy evidence, but in the devastating disappointment that preceded the arrests. Let us gently move our thoughts away from the flimsy evidence and towards the devastating disappointment that truly set the stage for Anne's destruction. The core of Anne Boleyn's danger lay not in the thin, contradictory evidence, but in the absolute dynastic needs of her husband, Henry VIII. In the turbulent political landscape of Tudor England, the stability of the realm and the very future of Henry's recently established Church of England rested entirely upon a male heir. The king desperately needed a legitimate son to secure the succession, a need driven by the haunting memory of the bloody civil wars from the previous century. Anne's failure to provide this son became her true, unforgivable political crime, regardless of any whispers of adultery. The final, crushing personal blow came in January of the year 1536. Anne had conceived once more, and hopes across the kingdom were incredibly high for the birth of a prince. But fate, or perhaps Henry's interpretation of divine will, intervened. Anne tragically miscarried. Crucially, the fetus was identified as a male child, a son that was almost a prince. This loss was far more than a personal tragedy. It was a devastating dynastic and national failure in the eyes of the king. It is recorded that the king's reaction to this news was one of absolute fury and a deep, crushing disappointment that bordered on the superstitious. He viewed the loss as a profound sign of God's displeasure with his current marriage. The king reportedly muttered words that quickly circulated throughout the court and beyond. "I see God will not give me sons," a chilling echo of his earlier conviction that his first marriage, to Catherine of Aragon, had been cursed and non-valid. This loss of a potential male heir proved to be the point of no return for Anne Boleyn. This devastating failure to secure the male succession provided the king with the critical context he needed. Henry VIII might not have fully or genuinely believed the fabricated charges of adultery and incest. It is far more plausible that he simply needed a rapid, airtight legal justification to dissolve a marriage that had ceased to serve its paramount dynastic purpose. Anne, who could not provide him with a legitimate male successor, was now politically disposable. However, a queen who was merely disposable was complicated to remove. A queen who was a legally convicted traitor and adulteress could be eliminated swiftly and decisively without questioning the legitimacy of her daughter, Elizabeth, or most importantly, invalidating Henry's monumental break with the Roman Catholic Church. In the ruthless world of the Tudor court, failure to secure the king's succession was not merely a personal matter. It was, in effect, treason against the future of the realm. The charges of adultery may have been false, built upon the fear and pressure exerted on Mark Smeaton, but they gave Henry the essential legal mechanism he required. The king could now swap out his failed queen for a new hopeful prospect. It was in this precise moment of dynastic crisis, after the miscarriage of the son, that the true nature of the conspiracy began to take shape. While Henry's absolute will provided the power, whispers suggested that the hand meticulously drafting the legal documents, compiling the evidence, and setting the fatal machinery in motion belonged to his shrewd and feared chief minister Thomas Cromwell. Henry decided the objective. Cromwell provided the means. While Henry VIII's absolute, dynastic will provided the raw, undeniable power needed for a queen's destruction, the actual blueprint for Anne's downfall is often attributed to a mind far more meticulous and coldly calculating. His chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was a figure both feared and respected for his sharp cunning and ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. It is a deeply unsettling irony that this man, who had once been a crucial, instrumental ally in engineering the king's marriage to Anne, now became the very architect of her catastrophic end. This transition from trusted partner to principal adversary is crucial to understanding the political machinations that occurred. Their powerful alliance fractured over fundamental disagreements regarding both policy and, perhaps more potently, money. Specifically, the vast wealth being generated from the ongoing dissolution of the monasteries became the central flashpoint. Anne, influenced by more progressive reformist ideals, desired this enormous treasure to be directed towards charitable works, education, and the creation of new grammar schools for the benefit of the common man. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist focused strictly on state power and treasury strength, saw the money as absolutely essential for strengthening the crown's coffers and, by extension, buttressing his own highly influential position within the government. This significant ideological clash swiftly evolved into a bitter, personal quarrel, creating a deep, irreparable fissure between the Queen and the minister who effectively ran the country. Cromwell, being too astute to ignore a weakness, recognized Anne's inherent political vulnerability and saw it as his opportunity. She was notoriously outspoken, deeply proud, and frequently intervened in state affairs, earning powerful enemies with alarming ease among the conservative faction of the court. Her passion, her temper, and her frankness, qualities which had once captivated the king, now provided Cromwell with the precise psychological and social leverage he needed. He could easily exploit the widespread resentment and weariness Anne had accumulated to construct a seemingly legitimate yet entirely fabricated case. Following Anne's swift execution, there are accounts suggesting that Cromwell privately boasted of his critical role in the affair, strongly implying that he had deliberately and meticulously engineered the conspiracy. While such boasts should always be treated with historical caution, they reinforce the prevailing theory that Anne's destruction was indeed premeditated. Did he truly plot her downfall simply to secure his own survival against a perceived political rival? Possibly. But we must be careful not to attribute the entire action to him alone. Cromwell, shrewd as he was always operating under the protective shadow of the king's absolute desire. He never initiated a bold move that Henry VIII would ultimately oppose. He merely delivered the lethal solution Henry desperately wanted. He provided the means, the legal and political scaffold, to achieve Henry's primary objective, a new wife and a clear, unchallenged succession line. Furthermore, Cromwell was not working in a political vacuum. A quiet, yet powerfully effective rival was already casting a long shadow over Anne's position. Jane Seymour. Jane presented herself as everything Anne was not, sweet, outwardly compliant, and submissive. The court, growing tired of Anne's passionate temperament and constant political meddling, saw in Jane a much-desired return to a calmer, more traditional vision of queenship. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, an observer with keen political sight, wrote of Henry sending Jane gifts, specifically gold coins and love letters, even while Anne was still imprisoned in the Tower. Jane, playing a clever, cautious game mirroring Anne's own behaviour years prior, refused these costly gifts, subtly stating that she valued her honour more than mere treasure. This highly public display of manufactured virtue only heightened Henry's rapidly growing passion and provided Cromwell with the perfect, quiet successor to position immediately after the execution. Thus, the political and personal stage was meticulously set for the swift, seamless, and legally justified removal of Anne Boleyn. The pace at which Anne Boleyn was replaced provides the most chilling evidence that her downfall was less a response to her supposed crimes and more a meticulously planned coup d'etat. The timeline of events immediately following her execution in May 1536 serves as a cold, undeniable testament to the king's premeditation, orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell. On May the 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn met her fate on the scaffold. She was buried without ceremony in a simple chest at the chapel within the Tower. Yet, before the day was even truly over, King Henry VIII began his celebration. Witnesses report that later that very day, Henry wore white, a traditional colour of celebration and new beginnings, signalling his joy and relief. The queen he once risked heaven and earth for the woman for whom he broke with the Church of Rome was gone, and he was already eager to move on. The next morning, on May the 20th, 1536, the king formally sealed his new path. Henry VIII was officially betrothed to Jane Seymour. The utter swiftness of this transition suggests that Jane was not a spontaneous rebound, but a meticulously chosen successor, already positioned and waiting in the wings long before Anne was ever arrested. Just 10 days later, on May the 30th, the king and Jane Seymour were married. Anne Boleyn had been replaced as swiftly and seamlessly as she herself had once replaced Catherine of Aragon. This rapid sequence of events strongly suggests that the plot against Anne was not just to remove a traitor, but to clear the way for the pre-selected future queen. Jane Seymour, by all accounts, was the precise antithesis of Anne Boleyn. Anne was known for her sharp intelligence, her fiery French-influenced style, her outspokenness, and her willingness to aggressively intervene in political and religious affairs. Jane, conversely, embodied the traditional English ideal of womanhood: quiet, pious, outwardly compliant, and submissive. She was perceived by the conservative faction of the court as the much-desired return to stability. Jane's self-presentation, and later her official motto, was often centered on obedience and service to the king, a deliberate, quiet contrast to Anne's more assertive queenship. The rise of Jane only added a powerful layer of political fuel to the fire ignited by Cromwell. It is highly unlikely that Jane actively plotted Anne's demise. She simply had to remain passive and virtuous while the men around her did the dirty work. Her presence validated Henry's actions, providing a pure, untainted image against Anne's fabricated corruption. Ultimately, we must return to the king himself. While Cromwell constructed the intricate legal and political scaffold, it was Henry VIII's destructive passion that provided the final, fatal impulse. As historian David Starkey put it simply, what began as a devastating obsessive love for Anne Boleyn had curdled entirely into a consuming loathing. Henry was notoriously changeable, subject to intense jealousy, and quick to rage when his will was thwarted, or most crucially, when his dynastic needs were not met. Once Anne failed to deliver the male heir, and once his powerful love turned to bitter disgust, he wanted her gone. And he wanted her gone now. Cromwell merely delivered the polished, lethal means to achieve the king's objective. Yet, Anne Boleyn may not have been doomed solely by the malice of her enemies or the desire of her husband. She may have provided the ultimate weapon against herself, with one truly reckless remark, an indiscreet slip of the tongue that echoed as treason in the wrong ears. We must now turn our attention away from the grand political conspiracies and the dynastic pressures and focus on a single, indiscreet conversation, a tiny, reckless moment that may have served as the final, fatal spark. For all of her fierce intelligence and political savvy, Anne Boleyn possessed a wit that sometimes moved far faster than her caution. a common trait for a sharp and bold woman of the court. Her tongue, which had once charmed a king, ultimately betrayed her. The incident centres on a seemingly innocuous, playful exchange with Henry Norris, one of Henry VIII's closest and most trusted friends, a gentleman of the Privy Chamber. Norris was an integral part of the king's inner circle, privy to the king's secrets and serving as the king's most personal attendant. This intimate friendship placed him dangerously close to the Queen. One day, Anne, in a moment of relaxed, courtly banter, began to tease Norris about his continued bachelorhood, asking him why he had so long delayed his marriage. Court gossip and speculation often centred on the love lives of the courtiers, and this kind of teasing was not uncommon, intended as light-hearted social pressure. Norris responded with a vague, non-committal answer, stating simply that he would tarry a time he would wait a while longer. The context strongly suggests he may have been waiting for some form of preferment or financial security before taking a wife. It was Anne's immediate, impulsive retort that tragically transformed harmless jest into high treason. She snapped back with words that history will forever remember as the potential cause of her doom. "You look for dead men's shoes, for if aught came to the king but good, you would look to have me." Let us pause and consider the immense gravity of that phrase. To look for dead men's shoes was a common idiomatic expression, suggesting that one was waiting for another person to die or be removed from a position so that one might take their place, often referring to a job or inheritance. In this context, Anne was implying that Norris was waiting for the king, Henry VIII, to die so that Norris could then attempt to marry her the Queen. It was, on the surface, merely a playful, even clumsy flirtation or a teasing attempt to force a more revealing answer from Norris. It was the sort of suggestive, slightly reckless banter that was, regrettably, somewhat common in the loose, gossipy atmosphere of the court. But the underlying meaning was profoundly dangerous. Under the strict Treasons Act of 1534, merely imagining the death of the king was classified as high treason. By suggesting that Norris was anticipating the king's demise in order to claim the Queen, Anne unwittingly provided her enemies with a terrifyingly plausible narrative of conspiracy and betrayal. Norris, fully aware of the dire implications of her words, was reportedly horrified at the suggestion and quickly denied it, strongly rejecting the implied treason. But the damage had been done. Anne's words, intended as a fleeting, careless joke, immediately fell into the wrong ears, or perhaps were deliberately reported to the king with malicious, devastating spin. For Henry VIII, already suspicious, jealous, and reeling from the dynastic disappointment of the miscarriage, this single conversation was transformed into irrefutable, undeniable proof. It confirmed his deepest fears. Anne was not only unfaithful and an adulteress, but fundamentally treacherous. She was not just accepting lovers, she was actively imagining his death. She wanted him gone. This single, fatal slip of the tongue granted Thomas Cromwell the final, crucial piece of evidence he needed to tie Mark Smeaton's weak confession and the general court gossip into a solid, legal noose. The seemingly innocuous slip of the tongue, the phrase about looking for dead men's shoes, was, in the deadly context of the Tudor court, immediately transformed into the legal lever that Thomas Cromwell desperately needed. While Mark Smeaton's forced confession of adultery provided the necessary moral scandal, it was flimsy and lacked credibility, especially coming from a musician of low rank against a queen. Cromwell was far too cunning to rely solely on such thin evidence, particularly when dealing with the high treason of a reigning monarch's wife. The remark by Anne Boleyn concerning Henry Norris was a true gift to the prosecution. It allowed Cromwell to pivot the charge from mere adultery, a crime which could potentially be managed or ignored, with an annulment, to the far more serious and unforgivable crime of high treason. The Treasons Act of 1534 was extremely clear. Any act, or even the intent to act, that involved compassing or imagining the death of the king was punishable by death. Anne's careless jest, implying a conspiracy between herself and Norris to marry after the king's death, fit this definition perfectly, painting a terrifying picture of a treacherous queen who desired and actively plotted her husband's demise. This single conversation, once brought into the official indictment, became the legal glue that held the entire fabricated case together. Cromwell could now tie the various disparate elements, the unsubstantiated court gossip, Smeaton's coerced statement, and Anne's own reckless words, into a solid, legally defensible narrative of an ongoing, murderous conspiracy. This narrative offered a much stronger rationale for execution than simple adultery alone, which often led to banishment or imprisonment, not the swift dispatch of the headsman's axe. The charges of incest with her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, were added primarily to shock and disgust the public, making Anne's crimes appear monstrous and morally unforgivable, thereby ensuring popular support for the king's decisive action. Therefore, many historians now argue that this single careless conversation was far more instrumental in sealing Anne's fate than any alleged sexual indiscretion. Her downfall was secured not through sins of the body, which were difficult to prove, but through the uncontrollable indiscretion of her tongue, which provided irrefutable proof of intent, at least in the eyes of the king and his chief minister. Anne Boleyn had fought fiercely, charming her way to the throne with intelligence, fire, and political agility. She understood the power structures, yet in the deadly, unforgiving world of Tudor politics, where the stakes were always life and death, one single, careless slip was all that was needed for her powerful enemies to turn her own words into a terrifying, irreversible death warrant. The queen who dared to rise so high and speak so freely had ultimately signed her own doom, not by her actions, but by the devastating power of her ill-chosen words. This legal maneuvering explains the staggering swiftness of Anne's demise. With the king's complete authority and Cromwell's calculated legal groundwork, the rest of the process moved at a terrifying, relentless speed. Anne had gone from consort to prisoner, and from prisoner to condemned traitor, in less than 3 weeks. The final, horrifying act was now ready to be played out. The legal machinery, set in motion by the king's desire and Thomas Cromwell's calculation, moved with a terrifying, unprecedented speed. From the quiet arrest of Mark Smeaton on April the 30th, 1536, to the final, horrifying climax, less than 3 weeks had passed. The rapid pace left no room for appeal, reflection, or royal mercy, underscoring the political necessity of her demise. The formal trial of Anne Boleyn took place on May the 15th, 1536, within the very walls of the Tower of London. This was not a trial intended to discover the truth, but a spectacle designed to legitimize a verdict that was already sealed. Anne faced a jury of her peers, a group consisting of 26 nobles, summoned to judge their queen. In a cruel twist of fate and political maneuvering, the court was presided over by her own uncle, Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, a man known to be fiercely hostile towards Anne and her family. His presence ensured the outcome was never in doubt. The charges read out were nothing short of monstrous. Adultery with 5 men including Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, Mark Smeaton, and her own brother, George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, as well as the unforgivable crime of high treason through conspiring and imagining the king's death. Anne, maintaining her regal composure despite the gravity of the accusations, pleaded not guilty. She spoke eloquently in her own defense, her voice clear and measured, refuting the charges point by point. She never wavered in her innocence, a fact acknowledged even by her enemies who admitted the evidence presented was thin and circumstantial. Yet, Anne's defense was merely a formality. The verdict was predetermined, an inevitable consequence of King Henry VIII's will and the legal framework engineered by Cromwell. She was found guilty of all charges. The sentence was then pronounced. She was condemned to be burned alive or beheaded, as the king might choose. The sentence, delivered by her own uncle, sealed her fate, branding the woman who had captivated an entire court as a wicked traitor who had betrayed both her husband and her nation. The tragic reality was laid bare. In Tudor England, a queen's survival did not rest on the law or evidence, but entirely on the pleasure and dynastic needs of the king. Anne had failed to provide the long-awaited male heir, and this failure, combined with her political vulnerability and a single unfortunate remark, was a crime far greater than any alleged adultery. The verdict was a political execution disguised as a judicial proceeding. Following the predetermined verdict on May the 15th, 1536, the swift, relentless countdown to the execution continued without pause. The very next step was to sever the Queen's final tie to the crown, ensuring that her daughter, the Lady Elizabeth, would be stripped of all claims to the throne, and that King Henry VIII would be legally free to marry again without the taint of bigamy. On May the 17th, 1536, just 2 days after Anne's condemnation, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, was reluctantly pressed into action. Cranmer, who had once been Anne's staunch ally and spiritual advisor, and the man who had orchestrated the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, to allow Anne to become queen, was forced to preside over a new, humiliating legal ceremony. Within the privacy of Lambeth Palace, Archbishop Cranmer formally declared the marriage between King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn to be null and void, meaning it had never been legitimate in the eyes of the Church. The specific grounds for this annulment were ambiguous, likely citing a supposed pre-contract between Anne and Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, or perhaps citing the king's claim that Anne was too closely related to him, due to Henry having had a prior relationship with Anne's older sister Mary Boleyn. The actual reason, however, was political necessity. This annulment legally reduced Anne from a queen and traitor to merely a mistress, and critically, rendered their daughter, Princess Elizabeth, illegitimate. This stripped the young Elizabeth of her title, and removed any potential challenge to the succession from Henry's future desired male heir. The same day, May the 17th, 1536, witnessed another brutal and necessary step in the conspiracy: the execution of the men accused alongside the Queen. On Tower Hill, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn, Lord Rochford, Anne's brother, faced the headsman. Mark Smeaton, due to his lower birth, was hanged, drawn and quartered, though Henry VIII, in a small gesture of mercy, often commuted this gruesome sentence to simple beheading for nobility. The sight of these 5 prominent men, all denying their guilt right up to the very end, demonstrated the terrifying reach of the king's will. They were executed not because of concrete evidence, but because their deaths were essential to make the charge against the Queen, the conspiracy, and the high treason appear real and definitive. Their shared fate isolated Anne completely, leaving her utterly alone to face the final, inevitable conclusion of her drama. The Queen, still imprisoned within the Tower, would certainly have received the news of her brothers' and friends' deaths, a realization that all hope of clemency or intervention was now utterly extinguished. The silence of the Tower must have been deafening, punctuated only by the dread of the approaching final day. The execution of Anne Boleyn was originally scheduled for May the 18th, 1536. This date was widely anticipated by the small, anxious population of London and the diplomatic corps, who were eager to witness the final, shocking conclusion of the Queen's rapid downfall. However, the event was abruptly postponed for 24 hours, shifting the grim appointment to May the 19th. This unexpected delay only served to intensify the fear and uncertainty surrounding the entire affair, adding a chilling layer of suspense to an already theatrical tragedy. The official reasons given for this delay were complex and somewhat procedural, yet they reveal King Henry VIII's calculated attention to detail, even in the matter of his wife's death. One crucial reason was to ensure that the execution of the men on May the 17th and the announcement of the annulment had fully settled into the public consciousness. More critically, the delay was needed to prepare for the arrival of the specialized executioner. Henry VIII, in a gesture that was simultaneously cold and perhaps a strange form of mercy, had decided that Anne would not be executed by the common axe, which often required multiple, messy blows. Instead, he ordered a skilled French swordsman to be brought over from Calais, then a possession of the English crown. The sword was reserved for executions of higher dignity, and a master swordsman was known to deliver a single, clean and swift stroke. This act suggested that even in condemning her, Henry wished to afford Anne a measure of respect and ensure her death was as quick and painless as possible, a chilling juxtaposition of absolute hatred and reluctant formality. The final, agonizing wait must have been torturous for Anne. Confined within the fortress of the Tower, with the grim knowledge that her brother and friends were already dead, every passing hour served only to heighten the tension. It was during this period of confinement that Anne displayed a remarkable composure, often noted by her jailer, Sir William Kingston. She reportedly joked about her little neck, and even managed to retain a dry sense of humour, perhaps an act of bravado, perhaps genuine psychological release. On the eve of her execution, she requested a final meeting with Archbishop Cranmer. This meeting was critical, as Cranmer had the difficult task of extracting a final, secret confession perhaps related to the legitimacy of her marriage that Henry required to smooth over any lingering legal or religious doubts. Whatever was discussed remained secret, but it was yet another example of how Anne was forced to play her final, political role right up until the last moment, ensuring the king's path was clear for his next marriage and the future stability of the Tudor dynasty. The stage was now set for the final, irreversible act on the morning of May the 19th, 1536. The fateful morning of May the 19th, 1536 arrived, casting a quiet, heavy stillness over the Tower of London. This was to be the final act of the tragedy, and King Henry VIII, ever the showman, ensured that even the staging of the execution was carefully managed. The scaffold was erected not on the highly public Tower Hill, where ordinary criminals met their end, but within the secure, private confines of the Tower Green. This move was calculated to limit the audience and prevent any possibility of a public demonstration of sympathy for the condemned Queen. The spectators were few, but highly significant. High-ranking officials, the Lord Mayor of London, several aldermen, and crucially, the ambassadors of foreign nations who would report back to Europe on the legitimacy and decisiveness of Henry's actions. Anne Boleyn, having spent her final night in prayer, and perhaps a strange, detached resignation, appeared on the scaffold shortly before 9 o'clock in the morning. She was dressed in a gown of grey damask, trimmed with fur, worn over a deep red petticoat, a stark and symbolic choice. Her demeanour was noted by all witnesses as exceptionally calm and composed, a final, defiant display of dignity that belied the horror of her situation. Her jailer, Sir William Kingston, later remarked on her courage, noting her remarkable fortitude right up to the very last moment. In her final public address, Anne delivered a speech that was a masterpiece of political calculation and necessary submission. She did not vehemently proclaim her innocence. Such an action would have been instantly interpreted as treasonous and could have endangered her daughter, the Lady Elizabeth. Instead, she spoke with measured obedience, accepting her fate as the will of God and the law of the realm. She never admitted guilt regarding the adultery, but she accepted her sentence. In the most astonishing part of her address, Anne praised the king, her husband and executioner, referring to Henry VIII as a gentle and sovereign lord. She asked the assembled crowd to judge the world and the Queen's cause for the best, and requested that they all pray for the king's long life and prosperous reign. This final, painful act of flattery was her last desperate attempt to secure kindness for her daughter, the only treasure she had left. After completing her speech, she knelt with a prayer book in her hands. She removed her iconic French hood, carefully tucking her hair. She reportedly whispered a final prayer. "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The executioner, the highly skilled French swordsman imported from Calais, moved with devastating swiftness. While a member of her entourage blindfolded her, the swordsman, whose method relied on the element of surprise, delivered a single, clean stroke from behind. The final act was complete. Anne Boleyn, Queen Consort of England, was dead. Her reign, which had promised so much change and fire, had lasted just 1,363 days. The indignity of her fate continued even after death. Her body was roughly placed in a hastily acquired, unceremonious El-Marrow chest, a crude container not fit for a queen, and was buried without a formal coffin, pomp, or even a proper marker in the nearby chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower walls. Henry VIII's final message was clear. Anne Boleyn was to be officially, completely, and irrevocably erased. Following the swift, brutal conclusion on the Tower Green, the day of May the 19th, 1536, did not conclude with mourning, but with a jarring display of King Henry VIII's immediate relief and callous disregard for the woman he had just ordered to be killed. The execution was barely complete when a message was instantly dispatched to the king, who was waiting impatiently at Hampton Court Palace, some 15 miles away from the Tower. Legend holds that Henry was hunting nearby in the surrounding forests, listening anxiously for the distant signal, a cannon shot, or perhaps a prearranged messenger that would confirm the deed was done. Upon receiving the news that Anne Boleyn was dead, Henry VIII's reaction was immediate and shocking. There was no pretense of sorrow or even necessary regret. Instead, he openly signalled his joy. It is recorded that on the afternoon and evening of that very day, he dressed in white, the colour of celebration, revelry, and new beginnings. This blatant public display was a profound insult to the memory of his deceased wife, and a clear announcement that he considered himself finally and joyfully free. His desire for a speedy replacement was even more astonishing. The king had been actively pursuing Jane Seymour, who was Anne's lady-in-waiting and a woman famed for her quiet, submissive demeanour, the very antithesis of Anne's spirited personality. Even before Anne's headless body was cold in the El-Marrow chest, Henry was moving forward with breathtaking speed. The very next morning, on May the 20th, 1536, just 24 hours after Anne's execution, King Henry VIII was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. This haste was unprecedented in royal history and served as a clear indicator that the charges against Anne were less about justice and more about clearing the way for a new queen who Henry hoped would finally provide him with the long-desired male heir. The entire macabre process, the arrests, the trials, the annulment and the executions was reduced, in the eyes of many, to a mere administrative procedure for the king to upgrade his wife. The marriage ceremony itself followed just 10 days later, on May the 30th, 1536, a startling confirmation of the premeditation behind Anne's downfall. The woman for whom Henry had risked his kingdom, broken with the Roman Catholic Church, and changed the very course of English history was gone, replaced as swiftly and decisively as she herself had replaced Catherine of Aragon years before. Henry's actions firmly solidified the common, cynical view. The Queen died not for her crimes, but because the King wanted another wife. As the curtain falls on the macabre final act Anne Boleyn executed, Jane Seymour installed, and King Henry VIII celebrating his freedom, the most enduring question remains: why did Anne Boleyn really die? The true answer is a murky blend of fact, paranoia, and political expediency, but history has distilled the reasons down to three primary, conflicting theories that continue to spark debate in scholarly halls and quiet evening studies. The first theory, the one officially sanctioned by the Tudor state, is the simplest and the most brutal. Anne was guilty. This theory posits that Anne Boleyn, a woman of ambition and sharp intellect, betrayed her husband and king. She was accused of seducing the men around her, using them to gain power, and even conspiring in the death of the monarch, thereby committing both adultery and high treason. Those who adhere to this view point to the initial, unretracted confession of Mark Smeaton as the single spark that ignited the whole devastating process. However, this theory is consistently weakened by the flimsy, contradictory, and circumstantial nature of the evidence, and the impossible dates cited in the official indictment. The confessions extracted were highly doubtful, and the notion of the Queen of England risking her life for a low-ranking court musician stretches credibility. The second theory, perhaps the most widely accepted today, is that Anne was the victim of a ruthless political conspiracy. In this narrative, Anne's destruction was orchestrated primarily by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, who saw the proud, outspoken Queen as a threat to his own survival and political vision. Their clash over the wealth of the dissolved monasteries was a major catalyst. Cromwell, fearing Anne's influence and her ability to persuade the king against him, spun the thin threads of court gossip and Smeaton's forced confession into a legal noose. King Henry VIII, volatile and furious after Anne's failure to produce a surviving male heir and captivated by the meek charm of Jane Seymour, allowed the conspiracy to happen, providing the necessary royal sanction. The timing of the execution, immediately followed by Henry's donning of white and his swift betrothal to Jane, makes this theory devastatingly persuasive, suggesting the charges were merely a means to an end. The third and most intriguing theory suggests that Anne unwittingly destroyed herself, not through the sins of the body, but through the fatal recklessness of her tongue. This theory highlights the deadly nature of the Treason Act of 1534, which made even imagining the king's death punishable by death. Her now infamous jest to Henry Norris about him looking for dead men's shoes was a carelessly spoken thought, a witty, but dangerous, double entendre common in courtly banter. When twisted by Cromwell and reported to Henry, who was already suspicious and looking for grounds for divorce, this single comment became the smoking gun. It allowed the prosecution to tie her alleged unfaithfulness to a clear act of treason. She was imagining the king gone. In the end, it was not her actions in the bedchamber, but her sharp, unfiltered words in the political sphere that sealed her fate. The final tragedy of Anne Boleyn's life is that perhaps the truth does not rest neatly within just one of those three theories. Perhaps it was all of them. A devastating synergy of political malice, a king's personal rage, and a queen's fatal misstep. Anne was, in essence, an outspoken, unlucky, and tragically trapped figure in the high-stakes, ruthless game of Tudor politics. She was destroyed not by one simple factor, but by a perfect storm of circumstances that she, with all her charm and intellect, simply could not navigate. The reverberations of her execution were profound, lingering long after her body was unceremoniously buried. For King Henry VIII, the brutal act seemed to cast a lasting shadow. Many contemporaries and historians suggest that Henry never truly recovered from ordering the death of his wife. While he celebrated his freedom and moved instantly to his third queen, Jane Seymour, some whisper that his soul grew darker, his tyranny more pronounced, and his paranoia more acute after May the 19th, 1536. His subsequent 3 marriages would each carry the implicit, terrifying threat of the Tower. For England, Anne's execution was a chilling, unforgettable warning. It cemented a brutal lesson that would define Tudor politics for decades. Queens could be adored, crowned, and honoured, but they could also be destroyed in the blink of an eye if they failed to meet the king's needs or if they challenged the established male order. The Queen's power was purely conditional, granted solely by the king's fleeting affections and the strength of her womb. Her greatest legacy, however, was her daughter, Elizabeth, who had been declared illegitimate following the annulment of Anne's marriage just 2 days before her execution. Yet, it was this daughter, who carried her mother's sharp wit and political acumen, who would later ascend to the throne as Queen Elizabeth I, becoming one of England's most celebrated monarchs. In a twist of historical irony, the woman executed for failing to produce a male heir became the mother of England's greatest female ruler. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn's true crime may not have been adultery or treason. It may have been the fatal mistake of daring to rise too high, to speak too freely, and to be too much herself in a fiercely patriarchal court that demanded silence and obedience. The mystery surrounding her death, was she guilty, or was she the most famous victim of Tudor political manoeuvring, continues to pull us in, ensuring that her story, and the dark secret of those 17 days, remains one of the greatest, most compelling tragedies in all of history. Now, as the terrifying story of Anne Boleyn's fall finally settles, let us allow the cold, sharp sounds of the Tower of London and the rushing clamour of the court to gently fade away from our minds. There is no need to grasp for one single, definitive answer. Perhaps the tragedy of Anne was never meant to fit neatly into any one single theory. Perhaps it was a painful, unavoidable confluence of all 3 things. Her own natural ambition, the uncontrollable rage of a king who felt betrayed, and the cruel conspiracy engineered by political rivals. Think of Anne, not as a sinner or a saint, but as a soul entrapped. A woman who dared to burn too brightly, yet was too vulnerable to the currents of power and the cold calculations of the Tudor court. She was destroyed, not by a mistake, but by a perfect storm of circumstances that she, with all her grace and sharp intellect, simply could not overcome. Take a deep breath now, and feel the relaxation spread through every exhale. We are no longer within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London. We are here, safe. Though Anne's passing was devastating, it left behind a strange and hopeful legacy. The shadow cast by this act seemed to haunt King Henry VIII himself. Many recount that his soul grew darker and his tyranny more intense after the 19th of May, 1536. His 3 subsequent marriages all took place under the ominous warning of the execution block, a terrifying reminder of the price of failure. Yet from this tragedy, a light eventually shone forth: Elizabeth. The daughter once declared illegitimate inherited her mother's full measure of intelligence, fierce spirit, and incredible will to survive. It is deeply ironic that the woman executed for failing to produce a male heir became the mother of Queen Elizabeth I, the great queen who would become the ultimate symbol of female power and one of England's most celebrated monarchs. The deepest message of this story is not one of fear, but a gentle reminder of the beauty of an unsubdued spirit. Anne erred when she dared to speak too much, and when she dared to be too much of herself in a world that demanded silence. That courage ultimately cost her her life. Remember this: the value of a woman does not lie in her ability to bear children or in her absolute submission, but in her own wisdom and spirit. Now, as the final images of the story vanish into the void, let the peaceful stillness of the night surround you. The tale is finished, but the deep reflections still linger. Carry this sense of calm with you into your sleep. Thank you for joining me on this historical journey tonight. If you feel relaxed and enjoyed these discoveries, please gently tap the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to explore more soothing and profound historical mysteries together. I wish you a deep sleep and the most beautiful dreams. I will see you in the next video.